Now, when Hurricane Harvey came ashore, I think that was 2017, what did they dump, 40 inches of rain on us in 48 hours? And President Bush called his son, who was no longer president, and he said, George, we don't need we don't need Bill, we don't need anybody, let's go to work, we need to raise a lot of money. And of course, George W. said, of course, I'm in. So I emailed my fellow chief of staffs and just told them that the two George Bushes were going to put together a Hurricane Harvey fund, and we did not expect them to get involved. This was all about Texas, and we got this. Well, one by one, all the chief of staffs called me and said, no, our guy is in. We're in. We're going to do this. So President Bush wanted to do a fundraiser at Texas A&M, at his library. He had Larry Gatlin coming, was going to sing in a tent, Larry Gatlin and the Gatlin Boys, and we were going to have like a barbecue and just have this little event. And then President Obama's chief of staff called. It was a Saturday night in October, and she said, he would like to come. Is that okay? And I'm like, okay. And she said, oh, and he can bring Lady Gaga. We moved the event from a tent to Reed Arena, where the Aggies play basketball. And I told President Bush Lady Gaga was coming, and he said, well, that's lovely. Who is she? He had no idea. Then President Clinton's chief of staff called, and he was supposed to be in Germany the night of the event. And she said, if you think he's going to let Barack Obama come to Texas and hang out with the Bush boys without him, he's coming home, he's coming. So out of courtesy, I called President Carter's chief of staff and said, all the former presidents will be there. And she said, and I quote, oh shit, he'll want to come. So this is a picture taken backstage at Texas A&M before the concert. Now there's a woman here who went to school. Where is she? Laura. Someone told me the woman, you think one of them is me, don't you? I don't know who the woman who looks like me is. That is so embarrassing that this woman photobombed the president. I tried to tell an audience in Nashville last week that that was not me, and I was wearing the same outfit. The other woman is a woman named Trace Birch, who this woman named Laura went to high school with her. This is a small, small world. Anyway, we photobombed the presidents. We're sort of embarrassed. But one of the reasons I love this photo, this is what we need to get back to. This is who we are. This is who we're supposed to be. The camaraderie and among these five presidents, they raised $41 million that night. Now, Lady Gaga helped. But, the power of the five of them working together, the other reason I love this photo is sometimes President Bush would get teased about his friendship with President Clinton. Some of his, very conservative Republican friends, even a few family members said, you're kidding me, Bill Clinton, why? And he always said the same thing, I'm old. I have run out of things to say. And when I'm with Bill, I don't have to worry about that because he does all the talking. So here you have five former presidents. Who's talking? But it looks like it's a good story, doesn't it? The other story I will tell you about this is when I told the Bushes, I told them together that all four former presidents were coming, and President Bush cried. He was so touched. He was so touched, not his son, but he was so touched that Presidents Obama, Clinton, and Carter were coming. Mrs. Bush looked at me and said, do I have to give them dinner? We did. I will tell you that they gave them dinner. Since I'm in Texas, you'll love this story. We were at the President Bush's library at Texas A&M. They had a very small apartment, a very small dining room, so they were going to have dinner for these guys. And I think Laura Bush came. I don't think any other first ladies came. In a small dining room. and there were a couple other key people in there. And Secretary James A. Baker III called me and said, Jean, I went in on that dinner with the presidents. I said, I don't know if any of you all know Secretary Baker, but you just don't say no to him. And I said, well, Secretary Baker, you probably should talk to President Bush about that. Oh, I did, and he told me to call you. So I said, yes, of course you can come. And he said, well, Susan would like to come too. I'm like, okay. Then he called me the next day. He said, Jean, Dick Cheney wants in on that dinner. I'm going to be honest, it was all about the gossip. He just wanted to hear what they were going to talk about. And he said, but we don't have to invite Lynn. Cheney doesn't have to bring his wife. And I'm like, oh my God. And I said, Secretary Baker, of course Vice President Cheney can come, but nobody else. You cannot invite anybody else. So it was a great dinner, and it was a great night. My favorite disaster story, though, isn't any of those I've told you so far. You all will remember this. When I talk elsewhere in the country, they don't. But after Hurricane Katrina, another hurricane named Hurricane Rita came ashore. I think it was about a week later, wasn't it? It wasn't very long. And after Hurricane Rita destroyed pretty much what was left of the Louisiana coastline west of New Orleans and a little chunk of Texas, President Bush got a call from someone who lived in Cameron, Louisiana. Actually, he called me. He cold called the office. And he said, Cameron has almost been leveled, including their hospital. And he said, we can't get any help. Everybody is in New Orleans. The media, celebrities, the fundraisers, FEMA's trying to do what they can, but they're overwhelmed. He said, no one's helping the victims of Hurricane Rita. And he wanted to know if President Bush could help raise money so they could at least rebuild their emergency room. He said, if we can open an emergency room and have health care in town, we think people will come back and start rebuilding. So President Bush said, of course, and he made some phone calls. I'm pretty sure he called Kuwait and said, you owe me. And they did. The week before Christmas, we were going to Cameron with $1 million check. The truth is, it was one of those fake ones. We'd already sent the money. We'd raised $1 million, and we were going to break ground for the new emergency room. The governor was coming, and the high school marching band was coming. It was a nice, sweet little event. And President Bush is going through the schedule, and he said, Jean, this schedule is sort of boring. I said, what? I said, a former president coming to town the week before Christmas with $1 million? That's boring how? I had attitude, I confess. And he said, Jean, Barr and I have been watching this TV show. We have fallen in love with it. We watch it every single night. It's called ER. And he said, there's a young man on it who we think is the star. His name is George Clooney. He said, why don't we invite George Clooney to go to Cameron, Louisiana with us? He said, do you get it, Jean? ER, ER. Well, here's what he didn't get. They're watching it in reruns on TBS. ER is no longer on television. George Clooney has made at least one, if not two, of the Ocean movies. He is People Magazine's Sexiest Man of the Year. He is a superstar. And so I said to President Bush, sir, ER is not even on TV anymore. And he looked at me and said, every night. So I said, you know what, sir, George Clooney is not coming to Cameron, Louisiana with you the week before Christmas. We don't know him. We don't know anyone who knows him. His politics are a little left of yours. He's not coming. And I stormed out of his office. I was tired and frustrated and needed to go Christmas shopping. I said, he's not coming. Yes, that would be George Bush and George Clooney in Cameron, Louisiana, the week before Christmas. This is why I had the best job in the world. One of the things I learned from President Bush is, don't be afraid to think big. He stormed back into my office that day. He could Google with the best of them. I think the only man he knew in Hollywood was a producer called Jerry Weintraub. Jerry Weintraub was the producer of all the ocean movies. So President Bush came in my office and said, "You didn't tell me that Jerry Weintraub knows George Clooney." And I'm like, and he'd called Weintraub, who called Clooney, who came. And on the plane coming home, unfortunately, it was a very short plane ride, everybody fell asleep but George and me. It was a moment. And I asked him why he came. I said, "Why did you do this?" And why? And he said, "I'll tell you why. I was so touched that he was raising money for a town that no one had heard of, that had been destroyed by a hurricane that no one had heard of, and that he was doing it not for the press, not to get credit, but because it was the right thing to do." They remained best friends until the day President Bush died. They stayed in touch, and it was he's a good man, and yeah, he's really cute. I mean, look how cute they are. They're just adorable. Anyway, the lesson learned, I think I learned something almost every day from him. And the lesson I think I learned from this one is you win some and you lose some. Don't be afraid to think big. President Bush loved quoting hockey great Wayne Gretzky, who once said, "You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Take your shot." And he took his shot and called George Clooney, and look what happened. I'd like to circle back to where we began, talking about President Bush and how he left a blueprint of how to live a life well lived. My editor felt so strongly about what we could learn from him that he asked me to write a second book after I wrote The Man I Knew. And he told me this over lunch in New York, and he said, "I want you to write another book about George Bush." And I looked at him and I reminded him that President Bush had died at the end of the last book. And I said, "I really got nothing. I don't know what you want." And he suggested a book about what we could learn from him. And I thought about it for about 24 hours. And then I was inspired to write this book. What this book is, it's a series of essays. I reached out to all the people who knew him best, some of his former head of state friends, family, friends, staff, just random people. I was hoping to get about 50 stories. There's 154 essays in this book. And it's everybody from former Prime Minister John Major of Great Britain to Bob Gates and Condi Rice. Secretary Baker wrote the foreword. Dan Quayle wrote the epilogue. Reba McEntire and Dana Carvey wrote essays. The young man who mowed the yard at Walker's Point wrote an essay. And that's the power of this book. There are so many different voices in this book. I love that Karen, who was back there checking people in, I'm telling on you, Karen, she started reading the book while she was checking you in. And one of the great powers of the book is you can read like one essay a day and then put it down. Actually, John Major told me that his wife, Norma, keeps the book next to her bedside, and she reads one essay a night and then goes asleep. So I would like to read from you a couple of my favorite essays in the book, if you don't mind. So the chapters, there's 7 chapters. One chapter is all his voice. It's speeches he gave, it's letters he wrote, some essays he wrote, it's some of his diary entries. I wanted his voice in the book, so I think it's chapter 6 is his voice. So this is from that chapter. This was in his Oval Office address. Do y'all remember who Rodney King was? Rodney King was the black man who had been killed by white police officers in LA. It was really the first major incident of that nature in our country. And LA broke out into riots, and President Bush addressed the nation from the Oval Office. And this is what he said. "We must build a future where in every city across this country, empty rage gives way to hope, where poverty and despair give way to opportunity. After peace is restored to Los Angeles, We must then again turn to the underlying causes of such tragic events. We must keep on working to create a climate of understanding and tolerance, a climate that refuses to accept racism, bigotry, anti-Semitism, and hate of any kind, anytime, anywhere. Tonight, I ask all Americans to lend their hearts, their voices, and their prayers to the healing of hatred. This next essay was written by Joe Strauss, former Speaker of the House here in Texas. Some of you all might remember him. He's from San Antonio. Joe wrote this essay for the book. Standing on what he called the front porch of democracy to give his inaugural address on January 20th, 1989, President Bush said, "I take as my guide the hope of a saint. In crucial things, unity. In important things, diversity. In all things, generosity." Now we're back to Joe's voice. In a present era when partisanship has risen and tribalism has spread, there is great impact in those three basic ideas: unity, diversity, generosity. Too often, the way to get ahead in politics is by appealing to someone's worst instincts rather than their better angels. We have been conditioned to think that the path to power is through dividing and conquering. In contrast, President Bush built bipartisan coalitions around lasting achievements, from the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act to Operation Desert Storm. I can think of no better remedy to the tribalism in our politics today than the words President Bush spoke and the approach he embodied. He knew how to tap into our common goodness rather than trying to exploit our differences. Every day, people go to extraordinary lengths to extend a hand of help or compassion, whether in their vocation or in their spare time. Why should our politics be so different? We can be competitive without being caustic. The principles that President Bush promoted in his inaugural address and in so much of his life, in and out of office, are bigger than any one political party or ideology. Decency and goodness transcend any construct of conservative versus liberal or red versus blue. That's from Joe Strauss, who President Bush wanted to be president one day. It's not too late, I keep telling him. I'm next going to read, this is President Bush's state funeral at the National Cathedral, and one of the eulogists there was John Meacham, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author, who also wrote really the definitive biography of President Bush called Destiny and Power. And President Bush asked John to be one of his eulogists. John started his eulogy by talking about President Bush being shot down during World War II and how that affected his entire life. And just to show what a small world this is, Gerald's fairly certain your father saw him being shot down. So what was traditional is when a pilot was shot down, the remaining members of the squadron would stay to protect the pilot as long as they could, the people in the water, to both, if there was an American submarine nearby, their aim was to show the submarine where the people in the water were and to protect them from the Japanese. He was shot down off the coast of Chichijima, and the Japanese kept coming out in a boat trying to capture him, and the remaining planes kept firing on them and chased them back to shore. So the tradition was when the planes had to leave, because they were going to run out of gas, I'm pretty sure it was Doug West who tipped their wings to say goodbye. We gotta go. And I'm okay. It's been an emotional day. You'll find out I'm good. And about that moment, an American submarine came out of the water and plucked him out of the water. His 2 crew members died. And President Bush talked often. He thought about them every single day. And John thinks it really defined his life. So this is what he wrote. Through the decades, President Bush would ask himself, why me? Why was I spared? In a sense, the rest of his life was a perennial effort to prove himself worthy of salvation on that distant morning. To him, his life was no longer wholly his own. There was always more missions to undertake, more lives to touch, more love to give. And what a headlong race he made of it all. He never slowed down. On the primary campaign trail, he once shook the hand of a department store mannequin in New Hampshire, asking the mannequin to vote for him. When he realized his mistake, he said, never know, gotta ask. You can hear the voice, can't you? As Dana Carvey once said, the key to a Bush 41 impression was Mr. Rogers trying to be John Wayne. George Herbert Walker Bush was America's last great soldier statesman, a 20th century founding father. He governed with virtues that most closely resembled those of Washington and Adams, of TR and FDR, of Truman and of Eisenhower, of men who believed in causes larger than themselves. Okay, I hate to say this, but I need a Kleenex. I'm good, but I need a Kleenex. Thank you, bag. 6'2", handsome, dominant in person, President Bush spoke with his big, strong hands, making fists to underscore his points. A master of what Franklin Roosevelt, thank you, called the science of human relationships, George W. Bush believed that to whom much is given, much is expected. And because life gave him much, he gave back. He stood in the breach in the Cold War against totalitarianism. He stood in the breach in Washington against unthinking partisanship. He stood in the breach against tyranny and discrimination. And on his watch, a wall fell in Berlin. A dictator's aggression did not stand, and doors across America opened to those with disabilities. It was and is the most American of creeds. Abraham Lincoln's Better Angels of Our Nature and George H.W. Bush's 1,000 Points of Light are companion verses in America's national hymn. For Lincoln and Bush both called on us to choose the right over the convenient, to hope rather than to fear, to heed not our worst impulses, but our best instincts. It was a beautiful eulogy. Sometimes I read the last 3 paragraphs if I think I can handle it. I think we know tonight I can't. So you're going to have to read the book to read the rest of the eulogy. So I also wanted to share with you this is also from the chapter that is his voice. When I found this diary entry, I read his diary, and I almost died when I read this. It's so him. It's him giving advice to himself. This is what he wrote in his diary the night he lost to Bill Clinton. It's 12:15 in the morning, November 4th. The election is over. It's come and gone. It's hard to describe the emotions of something like this. The job is not finished, and that kills me. Now into bed, prepared to face tomorrow. Be strong, be kind, be generous of spirit, be understanding, and let people know how grateful you are. Don't get even. Comfort the ones I've hurt and let down. Say your prayers and ask for God's understanding and strength. Finish with a smile and some gusto, and do what's right and finish strong. Oh my God, I miss that man. So, no story about George Bush would be complete without talking about that woman. That would be his wife of 73 years, Barbara Bush. And I can do this. She died 7 years ago today. Just about this time. I think she died about 5 o'clock in the evening. She was ready to go. And in fact, I went to see her every night She died at home. She was in hospice. I went to see her like 2 nights before she died, and she was out in the driveway drinking a Manhattan. And I walked up to her and I said, how are you, Mrs. Bush? And she said, I'm furious. She says, you see those people over there? And I look over, and it's the hospice nurse, President Bush's medical aide, and a Secret Service agent. She said, I was ready to die today, and they did not let me. I want you to go over there and fire them right now. I want them fired. So I went over and I said, yeah, you're fired. And they said, yeah, she fired us about 3 times a day. People ask me a lot if I miss them, and the answer is yes and no. What helps is I know they are exactly where they want to be. So I'm going to tell you a funny story that happened in the last couple days of her life. This actually was on Good Friday, and she died the following Monday. She died on Easter Monday. So on Good Friday, President Bush was actually at Methodist Hospital. He was in the hospital. And I got a call that she was on her way by ambulance, that she had taken a turn for the worse. So I broke the news to President Bush, and he said that when she got settled into her room, for the last couple of years, they had sort of a suite of rooms in Methodist Hospital. Methodist just kept 2 rooms. We were in and out so much. There were 2 rooms that was sort of their rooms. And he said, I would like to go see her when she gets here. Well, he looked awful. He'd been in the hospital for a week. He was on oxygen. His hair literally was standing straight up. He was in a hospital gown. Quite frankly, he looked like any of us would look if we'd been in the hospital for a week. So I'm trying to make him look better, and yeah, he looked awful. So they get her settled into her room. She's not in a coma, but she's somewhere else. Her eyes are closed, and she seemed to be somewhere else. And his aide wheeled him, put him in his wheelchair, and wheeled him in. And he's just sitting there, holding her hand, talking to her. And she, her eyes are closed. And suddenly they fly open, and she looks at him, and she says, my God, gorgeous, my God, George, you are just so gorgeous. He was not at that moment. Her eyes closed, and he looked at me and the nurses and went, theirs was truly a great love story. It was just a great love story. I would like to tell you one of my favorite short stories from Character Matters, which was written by one of her aides, Kara Sanders. Kara was one of Mrs. Bush's aides, and she was helping answer the phones in the office one afternoon. We only had 4 lines, and the first line rings, and it's Colin Powell asking to talk to President Bush. And before Kara could transfer him in, the second line rings, and it's Secretary Baker saying, I need to talk to President Bush right now. I wish I knew what was going on then, but I don't know. We don't know. We don't remember. And then Kara's like, okay, yes, sir, Mr. Secretary, one moment. And then, of course, the third line rings, and it's the governor of Texas, who happened to be George W. Bush. And Kara's like, okay, Governor, I'll be right back to you. Let me go tell your dad you're on the phone. And because God messes with us sometimes, the fourth line rings, and it's Barbara Bush. So poor Kara runs into his office and says, Mr. President, Colin Powell, James Baker, the governor, and your wife. You see those 4 blinking lines? That's who all those people are. Who do you want to talk to first? And she said, without hesitating, he said, put my wife through until the others, I'll call him back. He was a smart man. And I particularly hope all the husbands here are paying attention to that story. Now, Meg promised me that y'all would have a lot of questions, so I'm going to stop there. I would love to hear what's on your mind. And if you don't ask questions, I'll just keep telling stories. So I would love to know what's on your mind. Oh, you're being very shy. Oh, I know what this question is, but go ahead and ask it. So she asked how I met the Bushes. You're going to swear I'm making this up. First of all, you all should know that I grew up on a farm in mid-Missouri. My dad was a farmer. My high school graduating class had 57 kids. I went to a country high school. I was valedictorian. It wasn't that hard. For me to live the life I lived, it's sort of surreal. Sometimes I wonder, how did I get there? But to answer your question, I worked for USA Today for 4 years. In 1988, I covered the campaign. That was the year President Bush became president. And USA Today convinced Barbara Bush and Kitty Dukakis, she was the wife of the Democratic candidate, to write a weekly column for us. It ran every Monday. And it was stories from the campaign trail from the two spouses. And I was their editor. I was not excited about the assignment. I thought it'd be too confining, blah, blah, blah. In the end, I loved it. I traveled with each of them once a week toward the end of the week to try to find out what they were thinking about writing about. And I got to know them both really well and really liked both of them really well. And after the election, Mrs. Bush's chief of staff, I invited her to lunch because USA Today wanted to use my acquaintance, my friendship with the incoming First Lady, to pitch some pretty personal stories to see if the Bush family would sort of let me on the inside during the inauguration. And before I could tell her why I invited her to lunch, she starts complaining to me that she'd just been chewed out by President Bush's press secretary, Marlin Fitzwater, because Susan had hired a press secretary for the First Lady and one of the two deputy press secretaries. They both were from the Hill or from the campaign. They were not journalists. They were not reporters. They were PR people. They were campaign people. And Marlin said to Susan, for God's sakes, you've got to hire at least one journalist to work in the First Lady's press office. You need someone who knows how those people think. And you need someone who was a working journalist at one point in their life. And Susan's complaining to me that I don't know any journalists. I don't know who to hire. She was really mad. And I still remember when she looked across the table and looked at me and said, "You're me in this little play." She said, "Oh my God. Oh my God." And she offered me the job on the spot. It took me 2 weeks. I had to think about it. It was going to be a huge pay cut. I grew up a Democrat. They never asked. President Bush and I did talk about it later. They never asked. I grew up a Democrat. I loved my job at USA Today. I went home for Thanksgiving. My mom had already died. And I told my dad what was going on. And he looked at me and he said, "Let me get this straight. You've been offered a job to work in the White House for the First Lady of the United States, and you're thinking about it?" He said, "What the hell is wrong with you?" And I went to the phone and I said yes. So after they lost the election, I came to Houston to help her with her memoirs. She would want me to tell you that she wrote them herself, which she did. I was her editor, her researcher, her fact checker. It took us about a year, and I had a job waiting for me in Chicago at the Chicago Sun-Times. I was very excited. I was going to go back to being a reporter. And President Bush called me into his office. This would be March 1994. He'd been out of office for a year. His first chief of staff had retired. She was old and cranky. And he said, "Barr thinks," he said, "I need to hire a new chief of staff. I need to figure this out. I have a couple of ideas, but I'm not sure what to do. Barr thinks maybe you could help keep the seat warm until I hire someone." And I said, "No." I said, "Sir, I don't know how to be a chief of staff. I've never been anyone's boss. I can't bounce my own checkbook. I can't run your office. No, I'm going to Chicago." So he made a deal with me if I would do it until Labor Day. I promised by Labor Day I will have a new chief of staff. We never talked about it again. You know what? George and Jeb were both running for governor. He was busy. He hit the ground running in 1994. I think 24 years later, I said to him, "You do know that every day I wait for you to come in my office to tell me that you've hired a new chief of staff?" And he said, "What the hell are you talking about?" And he swears that conversation never happened, but it did. What else? Any other questions? You're very quiet. Should I tell you one last story? Are you sure? This is actually the day that I knew I would have to write The Man I Knew. President Bush was very close to a man named Prince Bandar, who was the ambassador from Saudi Arabia to the United States for 30 years. He was the dean of the Washington Press, the ambassador corps, diplomatic corps. He was ambassador the whole time President Bush was president, so he was ambassador during Desert Storm. So he and President Bush had become very, very close. By 2012, Bandar was back in Saudi Arabia. He basically was heading up the equivalent of the Saudi CIA. And a woman named Margaret Tutwiler, who worked for Secretary Baker for years, called me one night and said there's a rumor everywhere that Bandar has been assassinated by the Syrians. Have you heard this rumor? Well, the answer was no, I'd not heard that. It's not the kind of gossip I was privy to. And Margaret said, would you check your sources? Well, what she wanted me to do was to call the CIA. Because President Bush had run the CIA in the 1970s under President Ford for about 18 months only, but he loved that job. The CIA loved him, and they always had an analyst assigned to him to answer his questions. You know, they loved him. I think they wished he was still their director. And the whole time I was his chief of staff, I had classified clearance, which I would tell you was a mixed blessing. Sometimes ignorance is bliss, but that's another whole story. So I called our CIA analyst, and she said, we are aware of that rumor. We think it's true. Bandar has not been seen in public for months. He's disappeared. We think the Syrians have assassinated him and have hidden it. Don't tell him yet. We have boots on the ground. We're hoping to confirm within 48 hours. Well, the next day, Margaret called me and said that the French media had just reported that Bandar was dead, that he had been assassinated, and Margaret said, it will be on CNN in 30 minutes. You need to tell him right now. So we were in Kennebunkport at the time. We were sitting outside. We were sitting outside on a golf cart going over some work. We had a phone sitting on the bench between us, an old-fashioned phone. And we were just going through a bunch of work. And at the very end, I told him. And he looked at me and he said, did you try calling Bandar? The answer to that would be no. I had not tried to call Prince Bandar. And he said, well, let's get him on the phone. So I holler into the office, the windows are all open, and I said to his young aide, Jimmy Appleby, could you see if you get Prince Bandar on the phone? And Jimmy leans out the window and said, haven't you told him? And I said, yes, I have. See if you can get him on the phone. And about 20 seconds later, Jimmy leans out the window, Prince Bandar on line 1. President Bush picks up the phone. I remember this as if it were yesterday, and it was 23 years ago. Hey, Bandar, George Bush. Hey, man, are you dead or alive? Everybody here thinks you're dead. Uh-huh. And then he turned to me and said, he's alive. So Bandar tells President Bush that the Syrians are trying to kill him, that he's hiding, he's underground, they'll never find me. I almost wanted to shout into the phone, you might want to get off your cell phone if you don't want anyone to find you. But he said, Mr. President, they're not going to find me, don't worry. By the way, Bandar's still alive. His daughter is now the ambassador from Saudi Arabia to the United States, which is very cool. But so he and President Bush have a little chat, and then President Bush called Secretary Baker. He called his National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, to inform them that Bandar was alive. And then Secretary Baker called me back and said, what the hell phone number does he have for Bandar? And I said, I think that's classified, sir. So I gave it to him. I could not. So President Bush gets off the phone. He turns to me and he said, Jean, this is a good life lesson for you. If there is confusion about whether someone's dead, you call them. And if they answer the phone, they're alive. You know, I hate to admit this, but he has a point. And I'm determined one day to make that phone call, but I haven't had the chance yet. Anyway, thank you very much. Please come see me. Thank you.